Welcome back. We return once more to the cruelest depths of the 41st millennium. Today's tale follows a ghost from humanity's distant past, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. A master of steel and logistics, he is a relic of reason cast into an era of religious fanaticism where logic is a crime. Follow Zhukov to his journey's end, because the Imperium's final verdict was never about his mistakes. It was driven by a truth so devastating it could unmake the core tenets of the creed. A bitter twist on what victory means in a universe with no room for heroes who do not kneel before gods. The chronicle starts now. The sky above the forge world of Havel Row cracked open, revealing the bleeding wound of reality, a jagged violet-hued tear that pulsed with the sick light of temporal displacement. It was not the chaotic swirl of the warp, but something colder, a calculated breach in the tapestry of time itself. From this rift, a silhouette descended, wrapped in a localized storm of ozone and frost. Georgy Zhukov felt the bite of air that tasted of sanctified oil and ancient soot before his boots slammed into the cold metallic floor of a high-security containment vault. The chamber was a cathedral of gears and agony. Hundreds of tech priests, their bodies more machine than flesh, stood in a silent semicircle, their mechadendrites twitching in a rhythmic binary prayer. Opposite them, clad in hourglass-embossed power armor, were the grim agents of the Ordo Chronos. They held staves that hummed with the power to freeze a man's heartbeat in a fraction of a second. Zhukov stood in the center, his old earth-colored military uniform laden with medals from a world that had been dead for tens of millennia, looking like a blasphemy amidst the Baroque excess of the 41st millennium. A Magos Dominus, whose voice was a grating symphony of vox grinds, stepped forward. His many-lensed eyes whirred as they scanned the resurrected general. The Magos declared that the anomaly was stable, yet the biological specimen remained an impossibility. A ghost manifested through the sheer weight of collective memory and the specific rituals of the Ordo Chronos. The air grew heavy with the smell of incense and the static of 1,000 cogitators working in unison. Zhukov did not flinch. He adjusted his cap, his eyes hard as the Siberian ice surveying the nightmare before him with the cold detachment of a man who had already seen the end of the world once. "This century is not mine," Zhukov said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the mechanical hum of the vault. "But war. War is a language I speak fluently. It seems you have forgotten the grammar." A ripple of unease passed through the gathered Inquisitors. To them, he was a dangerous relic, a tactical archetype pulled from the depths of pre-imperial history to solve a crisis they could no longer manage with prayer alone. Inquisitor Voss, a woman whose face was a mask of cold duty, stepped into the light. She held a parchment sealed with the crimson wax of the Inquisition. She informed the general that his existence was a conditional miracle. By the authority of the Paradox Containment Edict, Zhukov was bound to a specific theater of war. He was a tool, a living weapon of logic. If his influence on the timeline, his historical weight, exceeded the threshold permitted by the Ordo Chronos, the containment protocol would activate. His soul would not merely die. It would be erased from the records of existence as if he had never stepped onto the soil of Havel Row. Zhukov looked at the glowing shackles of energy that flickered around his wrists, the physical manifestation of the edict. He felt the phantom weight of the iron chains, not on his flesh, but on his very essence. He knew then that he was a prisoner of victory. The Imperium did not want a leader. They wanted a calculation that could breathe. "I do not serve gods," he whispered more to himself than to the shadowed figures. "I serve victory, and I know it binds the soul in iron chains." As the first sirens of a planetary invasion began to wail in the distance, the general turned towards the tactical hololith, his mind already beginning to dismantle the chaos of the coming slaughter. The strategic sanctum of Havel Row was a cathedral of inefficiency, a cavernous hall where the air was thick with the smell of old parchment, sanctified incense, and the copper tang of overheated machinery. Thousands of scribes, their fingers replaced by clicking iron styluses, labored over endless scrolls of vellum, recording the expenditure of every bolt shell and every drop of promethium. To the Imperium, logistics was a holy rite. To Georgy Zhukov, it was a slow-motion suicide. He stood on the command dais, his shadow lengthening across a hololith map that flickered with the inconsistent data of a dozen fractured fronts. The magos of the Munitorum hovered nearby, their mechadendrites twitching as they calculated the tithes of souls required to hold a single trench line. Zhukov watched as a servo skull floated past its eye lens, glowing red as it stamped a verified seal onto a request for medical supplies that had been drafted 3 months prior. The men who had needed those supplies were likely already bone and dust. The general's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, his heavy leather boots thudding against the sacred floor tiles, silencing the rhythmic chanting of the binary servitors. He didn't look at the holy icons or the gilded skulls. He looked at the cold, hard reality of the numbers. The supply lines were choked by ritual. Munitions were being sent to sectors that had already fallen, while active combat zones were being bled white by administrative delays. "Explain this," Zhukov's voice grated like iron against stone as he pointed a gloved finger at the sector designated Sindral Nye. "You have 3 armored divisions sitting in reserve because they lack the ceremonial oil required for their engine ignitions. Meanwhile, the infantry on the front lines are fighting with bayonets because their ammunition is being held in a planetary orbit, waiting for a blessing. This is not a strategy. It is a funeral procession." A high-ranking adept of the administratum, his face hidden behind a gold-plated mask, began to protest, citing the ancient protocols of the Departamento Munitorum. He spoke of the spiritual purity of the machines and the necessity of bureaucratic sanctification. Zhukov did not wait for the adept to finish. He reached into the flickering hololith and with a series of brutal practiced motions began deleting the layers of sub-protocols and verification tiers that had existed for centuries. The room gasped. To the priests of Mars and the scribes of the Imperium, it was as if he were tearing pages out of a holy scripture. "You call this faith?" Zhukov turned his eyes, burning, with a pragmatism so sharp it felt like a physical blade. "I call this mismanagement. Victory is not won by the grace of a signature or the scent of incense. It is won by ensuring that when a soldier pulls a trigger, a bullet leaves the barrel. Everything else is noise." As the days turned into weeks, the iron echo began to reshape Havel Row. Zhukov implemented a system of mobile strategic reserves and direct-to-frontier distribution. He bypassed the central hubs, creating a web of logistical nodes that functioned with a terrifying clockwork efficiency. But as the supply lines straightened and the guns began to roar with renewed vigor, a different kind of shadow began to fall over the command staff. The Imperial officers' men who had spent their lives terrified of making a mistake in the eyes of the Commissars found themselves paralyzed by Zhukov's perfection. They saw the general not as a leader, but as an infallible engine of war. The flaw began to manifest in the quiet moments between battles. Zhukov's optimization was so absolute that it stripped away the initiative of his subordinates. In the command bunkers, colonels and majors sat in silence, staring at their voxcasters, waiting for Zhukov's specific coordinates before they would even move a scout platoon. They had become afraid to be wrong in the presence of a man who seemed to calculate fate itself. They were becoming puppets of his logic, their own tactical intuition, withering under the weight of his shadow. Zhukov noticed the silence in the Vox channels, a chilling echo of his own success. He had brought order to the chaos, but in doing so, he was inadvertently crushing the spirit of the very men he sought to save. Inquisitor Voss watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, her hand resting on the hilt of her power sword. She saw the efficiency, and she saw the danger. Zhukov was winning the war of materiel, but he was losing the war of the soul. The soldiers no longer prayed to the emperor for deliverance. They looked to the old man in the gray coat for their next shipment of shells. The historical weight of his presence was growing a localized gravity that was distorting the reality of Havel Row. The Ordo Chronos sensors hummed with a low-level warning. The paradox was deepening. Zhukov was a man out of time trying to fix a broken future with the tools of a forgotten past, and the friction was starting to burn. The execution square of Hive Primus was a grim slab of obsidian-stained concrete, shadowed by the towering spires of the ecclesiarchy. A freezing rain, tinted gray by industrial runoff, fell upon the bowed heads of 100 soldiers from the 402nd Cadian Infantry. They were knelt in the mud, their hands bound by iron wire. Before them stood Commissar Karsk, a man whose soul was forged from the same unyielding steel as his bolt pistol. To Karsk, the universe was simple. There was the Emperor's will, and there was heresy. The 402nd had retreated from the sulfur mines of the southern wastes without a direct order, and in the Commissar's eyes their lives were already forfeit. The sound of heavy rhythmic thuds echoed through the square, cutting through the low hum of the rain and the whispered prayers of the condemned. Georgy Zhukov approached, his long gray coat sweeping across the wet ground. He did not carry a power sword or a holy relic. In his hand was a simple, battered data slate, its screen flickering with the cold light of shifting graphs. Behind him followed a small flock of servo skulls, their mechanical eyes whirring as they projected tactical maps into the murky air. Karsk did not turn his head, his finger tightening on the trigger of his pistol. General the Commissar spat his voice like grinding glass. These men are cowards. They abandoned their post. The law is absolute. Zhukov stopped, his eyes fixed on the data slate. He did not look at the shivering soldiers or the executioner. Efficiency is also absolute, Commissar Zhukov replied, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of 1,000 battlefields. You call it cowardice. I call it a failure of supply. According to the Munitorum's own logs that were buried under 3 layers of blessing protocols, this unit was issued ammunition that was incompatible with their lasgun patterns. They did not retreat because they were afraid to die. They retreated because they had become useless as a combat force. To kill them now is not an act of justice. It is a waste of imperial resources. Karsk turned his face, a mask of scarred fury. Resource. They are servants of the throne. Their duty is to die for the God Emperor regardless of their gear. Zhukov finally looked up, his gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the rain in midair. He stepped into the Commissar's personal space, the smell of ozone and old dust radiating from him. A dead soldier cannot hold a trench. A soldier without ammunition is a target, not a warrior. I have spent my life trading blood for ground, but I do not trade it for nothing. Look at the numbers, Karsk. Their accuracy rating remained at 84% until the final moment of the breach. They fought until they were empty. That is discipline, not heresy. The tension in the square was thick enough to choke. The soldiers looked up, hope flickering in their eyes like dying embers. From the shadows of the cathedral, a group of administratum scribes emerged, led by a high-ranking clerk, whose robes were so heavy with scrolls they dragged in the mud. They carried the voucher of confirmation, a physical manifestation of the Imperium's glacial bureaucracy. The clerk cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. The general is correct, he stammered, holding up a parchment, sealed with the leaden weight of the Departamento Munitorum. The requisition error has been verified. The delay in confirmation was due to the required 3-week period of silent prayer for the cogitators. The slow, grinding gears of the system had finally caught up, but only because Zhukov had forced them to turn at his speed. He had bypassed the rituals, ignored the prayers, and gone straight to the cold logic of the ledger. Karsk lowered his pistol, his jaw set in a hard line. He could feel the power shifting. The soldiers were no longer looking at him with fear, but at Zhukov with a dawning sense of awe. They had been saved not by a miracle, but by a chart. "This gospel of yours, General Karsk," whispered his voice, trembling with suppressed rage. "It lacks the fire of faith. Be careful that your numbers do not become your new gods." Zhukov did not answer. He turned to the soldiers, his voice echoing across the obsidian square. "Stand up. You are not dead yet. There is a rail line on the eastern ridge that needs to be secured by dawn. You will find the correct munitions waiting for you at the staging point. Do not fail me, for I do not have enough ink to write your names twice." As the 402nd scrambled to their feet, their spirits reborn from the ashes of execution, Zhukov looked toward the horizon. He knew that for every life he saved, with logic, he drew the suspicious eyes of the Ordo Chronos closer. The gospel of numbers was a powerful shield, but in this millennium it was also a target. Sindral 9 was not a planet of soil and water. It was a scorched engine of war, a furnace world, where the very atmosphere was an abrasive mixture of smog heat and metallic particulates. As the heavy transport landers descended, their retro thrusters screaming against the thick, soot-choked air, the horizon glowed with the dull, angry red of endless foundries. Above the sky was a bruised purple scarred by the orbital bombardment of the encroaching Hive fleet tendrils. Georgy Zhukov stood at the open ramp of the lead Valkyrie, his face shielded by a respirator, but his eyes were fixed on the landscape below. It was a hellscape that felt disturbingly familiar. The ground was covered in a thick layer of gray ash that drifted through the air like snow. Zhukov stepped off the ramp, his boots sinking into the fine powder. He caught a flake on his gloved hand. It was cold, yet the air smelled of burnt hair and sulfur. For a fleeting second, the red foundries of Sindral 9 blurred into the skeletal ruins of a city by the Volga. The ash snow of a distant world, a memory of a time when he had fought for a different empire, settled on his shoulders. Stalingrad, he whispered the word lost in the roar of the landing zone. But here the scale was magnified 1,000-fold. Here the factories were the size of continents, and the dead would be counted in billions. The objective was the central rail hub, the iron arteries that pumped promethium and shells to the planetary defense belts. Without these veins, Syndral 9 would suffocate within days. Zhukov began barking orders, but not through prayers or hymns. He demanded precise timing. He established logistical nodes at every junction, his data slates calculating the exact throughput required to sustain the defensive lines. Engineers from the Adeptus Mechanicus, usually slow and ritualistic, found themselves swept up in his frantic pace. His presence was a gravitational force pulling the disorganized elements of the Imperial Guard into a singular lethal machine. The rhythmic clanging of hammers and the hiss of steam presses filled the air as the first rail carriages began to groan into motion. Zhukov walked through the encampment of the 12th Mordian Guard, who were stationed to guard the railhead. Hundreds of soldiers sat in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on the command tent. They were not cleaning their weapons. They were not studying the maps. They were waiting. A young lieutenant approached his hand, trembling as he saluted. "General, we are awaiting your specific directive for the patrol rotation. We didn't want to deviate from your master schedule." Zhukov looked at the lieutenant, then at the rows of silent men. He realized then the terrifying nature of the dependency he had created. By being too efficient, by being a miracle worker of logic, he had stripped them of their own survival instincts. They no longer trusted their own training. They only trusted his math. They were becoming hollow vessels, awaiting the input of his will. If he were to fall, or if his Vox link were cut, this entire army would collapse into a catatonic state. He saw the seed of fear in their eyes, not fear of the enemy, but fear of being without his command. He had saved their lives, but he had inadvertently stolen their souls, turning soldiers into mindless components of his grand machine. The war room of the central command spire was bathed in the flickering sanguine light of a massive hololith map. It was a digital ghost of the world below, but as the conflict intensified, the map seemed to take on a life of its own. Data streams representing troop casualties pulsed like open veins, and the territories lost to the encroaching shadows turned a bruised, necrotic black. Georgy Zhukov stood over the table, his hands pressed against the cold metal edge, leaning into the chaos. The air was thick with the hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic clicking of cogitators, but it was interrupted by the heavy rhythmic chanting of the ecclesiarchy. A delegation of priests draped in crimson robes embroidered with gold and carrying censers that leaked thick hallucinogenic smoke marched into the sanctum. The lead priest, a man whose skin was stretched tight over a skeletal frame, stepped forward. He demanded a sign, a miracle, to be televised to the millions of soldiers huddled in the trenches. He argued that the men were losing their spiritual fervor, that the cold logic of Zhukov's logistics was chilling their souls and making them vulnerable to the whispers of the warp. "Numbers do not inspire sacrifice, General." The priest hissed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The men need to believe that the Emperor's hand is guiding your hand. They need a saint, not a statistician. Give them a miracle, or they will break before the first wave hits the gates." Zhukov slowly looked up from the map, his eyes hard and unforgiving. He didn't see souls. He saw manpower. He didn't see miracles. He saw force multipliers. "You want a miracle." Zhukov's voice was a low growl that silenced the chanting acolytes. My miracle is that they have boots on their feet and shells in their guns. My miracle is that the rail lines are running at 98% capacity despite your constant interference. If they break, it will be because you filled their heads with myths instead of teaching them how to lead their shots. A miracle is just a name people give to an outcome they didn't prepare for. He turned back to the map, dismissing the holy men as if they were nothing more than faulty machinery. The priests bristled their hands, tightening on their gilded icons, but before the argument could turn into a confrontation, Inquisitor Voss stepped out from the shadows behind the tactical display. She raised a single hand, and the ecclesiarchy delegation fell silent immediately. With a sharp nod, she dismissed them, waiting until the heavy iron doors had thudded shut before she turned to Zhukov. The silence between them was sharp. She watched the general for a long moment, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, a face that belonged to a history book, not this nightmare. "They are right about one thing," Georgie Voss said softly, her voice devoid of its usual inquisitorial edge. She walked to the edge of the hololith, watching the red icons of a dying battalion flicker out. "I have seen worlds burn, not because they lacked ammunition, but because the soldiers simply stopped caring if they lived or died. Morale is a physical commodity in this universe. It is as real as Prometheum. Once I watched an entire hive world fall to a minor Xenos incursion because the local PDF lost their sense of myth. They saw only the darkness and the math of their own demise, and so they stopped fighting." She looked at him with a strange, almost pitying intensity. "I do not believe in their fairy tales any more than you do, but I recognize them as weapons. For these men, faith is the only shield they have against the sheer, crushing horror of what is coming. To you, it is mismanagement. To me, it is the only way to keep them standing when the logic of the situation says they should already be dead. If they don't have a saint to die for, they will find something else to fill that void, and I promise you neither of us will like what that something is." Zhukov looked at the bleeding map, the red light reflecting in his eyes, realizing that on this world, even his silence was being weaponized into a religion. The sulfur-choked horizon of Sindrelnay finally buckled under the weight of Zhukov's iron mathematics. For 3 days, the railhead at Junction Primus had been a meat grinder, a place where the logic of war met the screaming madness of the Voidborn. But as the double moons of the furnace world rose through the toxic haze, the screaming stopped. The enemy, a disorganized tide of cultists and mutated labor serfs, had been funneled into a killing zone so precise that not a single bolt shell was wasted. The Imperial artillery, guided by Zhukov's hand-drawn vectors, had turned the valley into a scorched graveyard. The first victory of the campaign was absolute. Zhukov stood atop a shattered bunker, his gray coat billowing in the hot, ash-laden wind. Below him, the smoke cleared to reveal a sight that would be immortalized in the propaganda pics of the Administratum for centuries. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a solitary figure of order amidst a landscape of utter devastation. To the thousands of soldiers looking up from the blood-soaked trenches, he was no longer just a general. He was a beacon. The setting sun caught the medals on his chest, making them flare like miniature stars. This was the hero shot, the moment of triumph that the Imperium craved. But as the voxcasters began to blare hymns of victory, Zhukov felt a cold stone of dread settle in his gut. The 402nd Cadian Infantry, The very men he had saved from Karsk's executioner were the first to move. They had been ordered to secure the ridge beyond the valley. Between them and the objective lay a sector designated as Gray Zone Delta, a patch of ground that had not been fully swept for subterranean mines. Zhukov's tactical data slate had marked it as a high-risk area, suggesting a flanking maneuver that would take an extra hour. However, the soldiers didn't wait for the update. They saw Zhukov standing on the heights, they saw his calm, and they assumed his silence was a command for a frontal assault. For the saint, for the iron echo, the cry went up from 1,000 throats. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fanaticism. Zhukov watched through his magnoculars as the men of the 402nd surged forward. They didn't run with the cautious, staggered movements of trained infantry. They marched in lockstep, their eyes fixed on Zhukov's silhouette. When the first mine detonated, a geyser of red earth and shredded flak armor erupted in the center of the line. The soldiers didn't flinch. They didn't dive for cover. They stepped over the smoking remains of their brothers and kept moving. Mine after mine triggered, turning the advance into a rhythmic pulse of explosions. To an observer, it looked like the most disciplined charge in the history of the Cadian Gate. To Zhukov, it was a horror. He realized they weren't being brave, they were being vacant. They believed that because he, the miracle worker, was watching, they were invincible. Or worse, they believed that their deaths were part of his perfect calculation, and therefore their survival was secondary to the geometry of his plan. They had surrendered their agency, their fear, and their common sense to the altar of his reputation. By the time the 402nd reached the ridge, they had lost nearly 40% of their remaining strength to a minefield that could have been avoided with 10 minutes of scouting. As the survivors planted the Aquila banner in the scorched earth, they turned back toward the bunker and cheered. Their faces were smeared with blood and ash, but their eyes were wide with a terrifying glassy devotion. They were waiting for his approval. They were waiting for the next number. Zhukov stepped down from the vantage point, his boots crunching on the spent casings of the heavy bolters. Inquisitor Voss was waiting for him. At the base of the bunker, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't say a word, but her silence was an indictment. Zhukov looked at his hands. They were steady, but the ozone smell of the warp seemed to cling to his skin more tightly than ever. He had sought to save them with efficiency, to preserve their lives through logic. Instead, he had turned them into puppets. He had planted the seed of fear in his own heart, the fear that in this universe you could not win a war without becoming the monster that the soldiers needed to worship. The Iron Echo was no longer just a nickname. It was a resonance, a vibration of the soul that was beginning to shake the very foundations of his identity. As the servo skulls circled overhead, recording every detail of the saint's victory, Zhukov turned away from the cheering crowds. He needed to find Havel Row. He needed to find the source of the numbers before the numbers consumed him entirely. The command sanctum was a tomb of cold light and silent data streams. Georgy Zhukov sat alone at a table forged from the recycled hull of a fallen titan, his eyes fixed on a single data slate. On the screen, the numbers of the 402nd Cadian Infantry flickered in a pale, sickly green. 3,412 souls had entered the valley of Junction Primus. 1,860 had walked out. To the administratum, this was a resounding success, a high-yield exchange of flesh for strategic geography. To Zhukov, it was a ledger written in the blood of men who had stopped thinking for themselves. The doors hissed open, admitting Magos Havel Row. the tech priest's mechanical lower body, a multi-legged brass chassis, clicked rhythmically against the metal floor. His mechadendrites were laden with fresh scrolls of vellum, still damp with sacred ink. General Rowe's voice was a grating series of binary bursts translated into a flat, toneless Gothic. The after-action audit is complete. The efficiency of the 400 seconds charge exceeded all predictive models by 14%. The expenditure of biological units has been logged as optimal for the acquisition of the ridge. Zhukov did not look up. He traced the line of a casualty graph with a weathered finger. Optimal. He repeated the word, sounding like a curse. I taught these men how to read a battlefield row. I gave them the tools to survive. Instead, they used my name as a reason to walk into a minefield without looking down. They didn't fight. They surrendered to the math. Since when did optimal mean the complete erasure of military common sense? The general's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen this tally too many times across too many worlds in too many lifetimes. Common sense is a variable that introduces error. Havel Rowe replied, his vox grill buzzing with a hint of mechanical condescension. The Omnissiah's grand calculation functions best when the components, human or machine, act without the friction of doubt. You have provided them with a certainty that exceeds their previous religious parameters. They believe in your victory more than they fear their own dissolution. Is that not the ultimate goal of leadership? To turn the chaotic mob into a singular, predictable tool of the throne. Zhukov finally looked at the Magos, his gaze sharp enough to pierce the priest's multi-lensed eyes. A tool that cannot think is a tool that can be broken by anyone who knows the sequence, he said. As he spoke, a stray gust of wind rattled the high stained glass windows of the sanctum, carrying with it a fine dusting of gray ash from the foundries outside. It settled on the table white and silent. Zhukov stared at it, and for a fleeting moment the command center vanished. He smelled the iron tang of the Volga and the charcoal scent of burnt grain. He saw a different ledger, a battered notebook from 1942, filled with the names of boys who had died, holding a single apartment building in a city of ruins. The ghosts of Stalingrad were never far away, but here in the 41st millennium they were becoming more tangible. In his previous life, the ledger was a record of tragedy. Here it felt like an invitation. Every time he optimized a supply line or calculated a lethal trajectory, he felt the historical weight the Ordo Chronos had warned him about pressing down on his chest. He wasn't just managing a war, he was feeding a predator. The ash on the table seemed to pulse with a faint violet light, the color of the rift that had brought him here. Suddenly, the cogitators lining the walls began to whir with a frantic, unscripted energy. The data slates on the table flickered, the numbers shifting and rearranging themselves into patterns that defied the laws of probability. For a second, the casualty list of the 402nd doubled, then tripled, then vanished entirely, replaced by a single word, repeated in an endless loop: audit. Havel Rowe's optical sensors flared red. External interference detected. The Mago stated, his limbs locking in a defensive posture. The logic engines are experiencing a recursive feedback loop. Something is counting us. Zhukov stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy pistol at his belt. He felt a sudden chill, a localized drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the furnace world's climate. The dependency he had fostered in his soldiers, the absolute reliance on his miracle of numbers, had created a breach. The Numerarch, the warp entity born from the cold, cruel mathematics of the Imperium, was starting to exploit the very bridge Zhukov had built. The data wasn't just bleeding, it was being harvested. "It's not an interference," Zhukov whispered, his eyes narrowing. "It's a debt collector, and we've spent too much." The general walked toward the main tactical hololith. The map of Sindral 9 was warping the lines of the railroads, twisting into the shape of an abacus made of bone. He realized then that his greatest flaw wasn't a lack of faith, but his over-reliance on a truth that this universe could turn into a lie. He had sought to save his men from the madness of the warp, with the cold light of logic, only to find that in the dark, even logic can grow teeth. The cost ledger was no longer a record of the past. It was a blueprint for a sacrifice that he wasn't yet ready to make. Deep in the binary static of the warp, where the collective dread of the Administratum's trillions converged, a new nightmare had finished its gestation. It was the Ledger Shrine, a cathedral of non-Euclidean geometry, where the walls were composed of endless shifting scrolls of flayed skin, and the pillars were stacks of calcified skulls, each etched with a barcode of condemnation. This was the domain of the Numerarch, a parasitic entity born from the cold, unfeeling cruelty of imperial mathematics. It was a god of the audit, a deity of the deficit. Here, every soldier who had ever died for a missed supply shipment or a misplaced decimal point was preserved as a flickering, agonizing digit in an eternal sum that never reached zero. On the surface of Sindral 9, the anomaly manifested as a sudden, horrific distortion of physical law. In the trenches of the 402nd, a sergeant leveled his last pistol at a charging cultist and pulled the trigger. The weapon hummed, the power cell was full, but instead of a beam of coherent light, nothing but a puff of gray soot emerged from the barrel. The logic of the weapon had been overruled. Across the sector, hundreds of soldiers found their equipment failing in ways that defied mechanical explanation. High explosive shells turned into solid lead weights mid-flight. Promethium fuel lost its ability to ignite because the probability of combustion had been stripped from the local reality. The Numerarch was editing the battlefield, turning the soldiers' growing fear of failure into the very cause of their destruction. In the command sanctum, the primary hololith didn't just flicker, it bled. A thick ink-like substance began to ooze from the projector, pooling on the metal floor in the shape of a massive distorted abacus. The voxcasters meant for tactical updates began to emit a sound like a million pins scratching on dry bone. Then a voice emerged, not a human voice, but a composite of 1,000 vox-distorted screams, tuned to a perfect mathematical frequency. "You seek to master the outcome, Georgy Zhukov." The sound vibrated through the general's very marrow. "You treat the soul as a variable to be balanced. You optimize the machinery of death, thinking you can control the waste." A spectral figure began to coalesce above the pool of ink, a towering, multi-armed horror draped in robes of tattered parchment. Its face a blank porcelain mask with a single glowing red lens for an eye. It was the Numerarch. "I am the sum of all your calculations," the entity hissed, its arms moving in a blurring frenzy as it manipulated invisible strings of data. "I am the debt that the Imperium refuses to pay. You give them numbers to live by, but I give them numbers to die by. You optimize death, Georgie. I eternalize it. Every casualty you tallied at the ridge is now a brick in my shrine, a permanent record of your optimal failure." The entity reached out a skeletal hand, and the tactical map of Sindral 9 began to dissolve into a sea of red zeros. Zhukov stood his ground, his eyes narrowing as he watched his reality being dismantled by a nightmare born of his own methods. He felt the ozone smell of the warp thickening the air, becoming heavy with the pressure of 1,000,000,000,000 unread reports. He realized that the numerarch wasn't just an enemy, it was a mirror. It was the logical conclusion of a system that valued the ledger over the man. As the ledger's shrine began to bleed into the physical world, turning the foundries of Sindral Nime into a charnel house of statistics, Zhukov knew that logic alone would no longer suffice. He was being outcalculated by the very shadow he had cast across the stars. "If you want the debt," Zhukov growled, drawing his heavy pistol and firing into the center of the apparition, "come and collect it in person." The command spire had undergone a grotesque metamorphosis. What was once a clean, functional hub of tactical cogitators and logistical data streams had been forcibly repurposed into a cathedral of propaganda. Massive tapestries woven from fire-resistant fiber and stained with the blood of martyrs hung from the rafters, depicting a towering figure in a gray greatcoat leading a legion of faceless soldiers through a storm of iron. The smell of ozone and industrial grease was now choked by the cloying sweetness of sacred incense. In every corner, cherubs, cyborg infants with vat-grown wings fluttered about, trailing scrolls of scripture that translated Zhukov's tactical maxims into holy litanies. Georgy Zhukov walked through the halls of his own headquarters, feeling like a ghost haunting a temple dedicated to his own memory. He saw hardened Cadian veterans kneeling before a gilded statue of himself, their lips moving in silent prayer. They weren't asking for ammunition or reinforcements. They were asking for his grace. The efficiency he had brought to the war had been rebranded as a miracle. To the Imperium, it was easier to believe in a saint than to understand a supply chain. He stopped in front of a massive mural showing him crushing a traitor's skull with a hand made of lightning, a power he certainly did not possess. Inquisitor Voss appeared from behind a pillar of incense smoke. Her armor was polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the flickering candlelight of the Saint Factory. She looked at the mural, then at Zhukov, her expression unreadable. "You look disgusted, General," she said, her voice barely a whisper beneath the drone of the chanting acolytes. "But look at their eyes. For the first time since the invasion began, they aren't looking at the horizon with dread. They are looking at you with hope. It is a fragile manufactured thing, but it is holding them together." Zhukov turned to her, his jaw set in a hard line. "This is a lie, Voss. I am a man of flesh and bone, a soldier who knows how to move batteries and manage depots. I am not a conduit for the divine. By letting them believe this, you are preparing them for a fall that will be 10 times more devastating when the truth comes out. You are building a fortress on a foundation of smoke." He gestured to the factory-like assembly of priests and scribes working around the clock to churn out icons and holy tactical maps. "You aren't winning a war. You're managing a mass delusion." Voss stepped closer, her gaze intensifying. "I saw a world fall once, Georgy. It was a jewel of the segmentum, well defended and well supplied. But the governor was a man of cold logic, much like you. He told the people the truth, that the odds were against them, that every death was a calculated necessity. He stripped away the myth of imperial protection to improve efficiency. And you know what happened. The soldiers didn't fight harder. They realized that if they were just numbers, their survival didn't matter. They surrendered to the first Xeno ship that entered the system. They chose a quick death over a logical one. She placed a hand on the cold stone of a nearby altar. In this universe, sainthood is a factory-produced weapon. I am the foreman of that factory. I give them the myth so they have a reason to pull the trigger when their hands are shaking. I don't care if it's a lie as long as it kills the enemies of mankind. You are the Iron Echo because the people needed an echo to follow. If I have to turn your tactical reports into holy gospels to keep this planet from falling into the warp, I will do it without a second thought. The symmetry was suffocating. On one side of the conflict, the numerarch was building a ledger shrine of statistical despair, turning men into agonizing digits. On the other, Voss was building a saint factory of spiritual zeal, turning the same men into mindless icons of faith. Both systems sought to strip the soldier of his humanity, replacing his will with a preordained script. Zhukov felt like he was caught between two grindstones, both of them fueled by the same disregard for the individual. The saint and the statistic were two sides of the same cold imperial coin. He looked out the high windows of the spire. Below, in the courtyard, a fresh division of reinforcements was being blessed by a high priest who held a data slate containing Zhukov's logistical orders as if it were a holy relic. The soldiers cheered, a sound of terrifying, unified devotion. Zhukov realized that he had lost control of his own image. He was no longer the general, he was the icon, and icons, he knew from a lifetime of war, were often the first things to be shattered when the tide turned. If they die for a ghost, Zhukov whispered, the smell of ozone stinging his nostrils, they die for nothing. Voss didn't respond. She simply watched the soldiers, her face a mask of cold, inquisitorial necessity. The Saint factory continued its work, the rhythmic clanging of the smith's hammers, sounding like a funeral bell for the truth. Zhukov walked back to his tactical table, but even there the hololith had been draped in silk and surrounded by candles. The war was no longer about ground or fuel. It was a battle between two competing myths, and he was the unwilling centerpiece of one of them. He began to draw his own maps on a scrap of plain parchment, a small act of rebellion against the divinity that was threatening to swallow him whole. The field tribunal was held in the shadow of a colossal, soot-stained statue of the emperor, within a courtyard where the air was perpetually thick with the metallic tang of blood and the electric hum of executioner blades. Rain, heavy, greasy, and black with factory waste, lashed against the iron bleachers where the high command sat. At the center of the mud-slicked arena stood the survivors of the 88th Armored Division. Their tanks were gone, their uniforms were shredded rags, and their eyes were hollow pits of exhaustion. They were being tried for tactical apostasy, the crime of retreating from a position that the central cogitators had designated as impregnable. Commissar Karsk stood before the accused, his black greatcoat slick with rain. He held a scroll of judgment, his voice amplified by a vox grill that made him sound like a judge of the underworld. The logic engines of the Administratum decreed that Sector 7G could be held for 72 hours. You abandoned it in 6. By doing so, you created a vacuum in our supply line that cost 3,000 lives in the neighboring sector. You traded the Emperor's ground for your own wretched hides. The sentence is death. The soldiers did not protest. In the Imperium, there was no defense against the cold verdict of a machine. A heavy thud of boots silenced the crowd. Georgy Zhukov stepped into the arena, his gray coat darkened by the rain, his face a mask of weathered granite. He did not look at the Commissar. He looked at the soldiers. He didn't check his data slate. Instead, he walked to the sergeant of the 88th and looked him in the eye. Sergeant Zhukov's voice was low, but it carried across the silent courtyard. The cogitators said the ground was solid. The maps said you had a clear line of fire. Why did you pull back? The sergeant stammered, his voice trembling. General! It wasn't the maps, the air. It went quiet. The birds, the scavengers, they all flew north, and the shadows in the ruins didn't move with the sun. It felt like a trap. It felt like the ground was waiting to swallow us. Karsk stepped forward, his hand on his bolt pistol. Feelings, you dare bring feelings to a court of war. The general's own optimization protocols showed a 92% success rate for that defense. Zhukov turned to Karsk, his eyes burning with a sudden fierce lucidity. The protocol was wrong. He stated the words falling like iron hammers. I wrote that protocol based on static data, but war is not static. The sergeant was right to retreat. My maps didn't show the subterranean gas pockets that the enemy was about to ignite. My numbers didn't account for the silence of a predator. I was blinded by my own optimization, but these men, they used their eyes. They used the one thing a machine doesn't have, the instinct to survive a lie. With a brutal gesture, Zhukov snatched the scroll of judgment from Karsk's hand and tore it in two. I am the architect of the strategy on this planet. If there is a failure, it is mine. These men are not cowards. They are the only ones in this army who haven't turned into vox puppets. I am reinstating them to the front. We win by fighting the enemy we see, not the enemy the cogitator imagines. A stunned silence gripped the courtyard, followed by a low, rising roar from the thousands of soldiers watching from the heights. They weren't just cheering for a reprieve. They were cheering for a man who had chosen humanity over the ledger. Zhukov, the saint, the iron echo. The chant began to shake the very foundations of the spire. High above, in a concealed observation gallery, the agents of the Ordo Kronos felt the temperature drop to sub-zero. The historical influence meter on their brass consoles suddenly spiked, the needle slamming into the red zone with a violent crack. Zhukov's intervention hadn't just saved a few soldiers. He had broken the protocol of fate. By proving the fallibility of the system, he had altered the trajectory of the entire campaign. A klaxon began to wail deep within the walls, a sound only the Inquisitors could hear. It was the signal of a paradox alert. Zhukov was no longer just a tool. He was a tear in the fabric of the Imperium's preordained history. The war for Sindral 9 had devolved into a stationary nightmare of fire and iron. The steel ring, as the soldiers had begun to call it, was a concentric network of trenches, dragon's teeth, and fortified bunkers that stretched across the blackened crust of the planet for thousands of kilometers. At the center of this ring was Georgy Zhukov. He had moved his command center from the gilded spires of the command tower to a subterranean bunker reinforced with meters of blessed plasteel and lead. Here the air was cold, damp, and smelled of wet earth and graphite, a stark contrast to the sterile, ozone-heavy atmosphere of the high command sanctums. The numerarch's influence was no longer a subtle whisper. It had become a digital plague. Across the front lines, the voxcasters screamed with the sound of grinding metal, and the advanced targeting cogitators of the Lehman Russ tanks had begun to display impossible coordinates, directing fire into friendly lines or into empty, scorched earth. The machines were being betrayed by their own logic. Zhukov watched as a master artillerist stared in horror at a data slate that claimed his shells were traveling backward through time. The general did not hesitate. He walked to the main tactical hololith, which was flickering with a nauseating violet light, and smashed it with the butt of his heavy pistol. "Enough of this sorcery," Zhukov's voice boomed, echoing off the concrete walls. "If the enemy can hide in the numbers, we will fight without them. Bring me the paper, bring me the charcoal, bring me the runners." The tech priests protested, their binary cant rising in a panicked hum. To them, abandoning the cogitators was a descent into barbarism, a betrayal of the Omnissiah. But Zhukov ignored them. He spread a massive hand-drawn map across a wooden table, a map of ink and blood marked with physical pins and manual coordinates. He ordered every Vox unit to be powered down and every targeting computer to be disconnected. The change was instantaneous and brutal. The siege doctrine was born from the dirt. Orders were no longer sent as encrypted data bursts. They were written on scraps of parchment and carried by runners who dodged mortar fire and crawled through mud. Artillery calculations were done by hand using slide rules and the raw intuition of men who had lived in the dirt for years. The Numerarch's ledger shrine found itself attacking ghosts. It could not edit a piece of lead pencil on a crumpled map. It could not manipulate the probability of a runner's heartbeat. Zhukov had taken the war out of the realm of statistics and dragged it back into the realm of sweat and bone. The cost was staggering. Without the predictive algorithms, the casualty rates climbed as the Imperial Guard relied on sheer weight of fire and human endurance. The war of attrition became a meat grinder of the most primitive sort. Zhukov sat in his bunker, surrounded by the constant thud of manual artillery and the scratching of pencils. He looked like a man who had finally returned home. The historical weight around him had solidified into a physical presence, a cold aura that made the very air in the bunker feel ancient. He was no longer just fighting for a planet. He was proving that a man could still stand in a universe of gods and machines if he was willing to bleed enough for the ground beneath his feet. In the trenches, the soldiers felt the shift. They were exhausted, their uniforms were caked in layers of ash and frozen mud, and their numbers were dwindling. But for the first time they felt a strange sense of clarity. They weren't waiting for a miracle or a calculation. They were looking at their sergeants, listening for the blow of a whistle, and relying on the man to their left. The seed of fear had changed. They were no longer afraid of failing the machine. They were only afraid of failing each other. Zhukov had stripped away the divinity of the war, and in the cold gray light of the trenches, the soldiers had found their own grim human resolve. The Numerarch, sensing the defiance, began to manifest physically on the battlefield, not as a ghost in the machine, but as a towering distortion of reality that walked through the manual artillery fire as if it were rain. It sought the source of the iron echo, the one mind that refused to be tallied. Zhukov, hearing the reports of the entity's approach through a gasping, blood-stained runner, simply sharpened his pencil. "Let it come," he whispered, the smell of Stalingrad's winter suddenly filling the bunker. "A ledger cannot kill what it cannot count, and today we are counting only the shells we have left." The subterranean bunker was no longer a refuge. It had become a thin membrane between two worlds. The candles flickered with a cold, violet light, and the very air felt thick, as if the room were slowly filling with invisible water. The manual maps on the table began to curl at the edges, the charcoal lines shifting like restless snakes. Georgy Zhukov sat alone, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thud of manual artillery. He felt a presence behind him, a weight of existence so immense that it threatened to crush his lungs. He did not turn. He simply adjusted his cap and stared at the map of Sindral Gate. Slowly the shadows in the corner of the room began to knit together, weaving a silhouette that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was a man in a gray greatcoat, but the coat was forged from interlocking plates of cold black iron. The medals on its chest were not bronze or silver, but glowing shards of crystallized agony, each one humming with the screams of the fallen. Its face was a polished mask of Siberian ice, and its eyes were twin voids of absolute unyielding order. This was the warp reflection of Georgy Zhukov, the iron echo given form by the desperate prayers of 1 trillion souls who needed a savior to worship. The creature did not breathe, but when it spoke, the sound was like 1,000 tanks grinding over a field of bones. "You fight for the dirt, Georgy." The reflection rasped its voice, echoing in the general's mind. "You cling to the mortality of your soldiers as if it were a virtue. But look at me. I am the victory you seek. I am the logic that never fails, and the icon that never dies. Accept me, and this war ends tonight. The numerarch will be shattered. The gate will be held, and your men will live, because they will no longer be men. They will be my extensions." Zhukov finally turned his weathered face, looking incredibly small and frail compared to the towering iron-clad god before him. He stood up, his old leather boots creaking, and looked his divine twin in the eye. "You are not me, Zhukov," whispered his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure. "You are a lie born from fear. You are the optimal result that Havel Row wanted, a machine that looks like a man. I have spent my life leading soldiers, not steering puppets. A victory bought with the soul of the army is not a victory. It is a surrender to the very madness we are supposed to be fighting." The heavy iron door of the bunker groaned open, and Inquisitor Voss stepped inside. She stopped, her eyes wide, as she beheld the spectral manifestation. Her hand went to her holster, but she did not draw her weapon. Instead, she fell to one knee, her head bowed. "General," she gasped, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and awe. It is the manifestation of the Emperor's will through you. This is the weapon we have been building in the Saint Factory. Look at it. With this power, Sindral Nye is saved. The Ordo Chronos cannot erase a god. Accept the mantle. Give the soldiers their miracle." She looked up at Zhukov, her eyes pleading. "I am begging you, Georgy. I have seen too many worlds burn because we were too proud to use the tools the warp provided. If you reject this, thousands of your men will die in the mud tonight. If you embrace it, they will march home as heroes of a holy war. What is one man's ego compared to the survival of a sector? Let the legend take over. Let the iron echo win." Zhukov looked from the Inquisitor to the iron monster, the smell of ozone, and Stalingrad's frost reaching a suffocating crescendo. Zhukov walked toward the spectral twin until he was mere inches from the cold iron chest. He reached out a hand, not to embrace it, but to touch the charcoal-drawn map on the table behind it. A hero who is forced to be a hero is just a slave with a better title, Zhukov said, his voice echoing with a quiet, devastating authority. "Voss, you wanted a miracle. I will give you a soldier's truth instead." With a sudden, violent movement, he threw a flask of sanctified machine oil over the map and the candles. The table erupted in a mundane orange flame, the heat of the fire clashing with the warp chill. As the physical fire consumed the symbols of his command, the spectral image of the iron echo began to flicker and distort. It shrieked a sound of grinding metal and wounded pride before dissolving back into the shadows. The pressure in the room vanished, replaced by the simple, acrid smell of burning wood and oil. Zhukov turned to the stunned Inquisitor, his face illuminated by the dying embers. "The miracle is over, Voss. Now get up. We have a battle to win with the men we have left, not the gods you wish we were." Like and subscribe to the channel to follow Zhukov's next moves as he defies both the Warp and the Inquisition. The Sanctuary of the Iron Echo was a masterpiece of religious architecture and military hubris. Built atop the massive Prometheum reservoirs of the Syndral Gate, the cathedral fortress was a forest of gilded spires and heavy gun batteries. To the soldiers of the Imperial Guard, this was the holiest ground on the planet, the place where the general's miracles were whispered to have originated. To Inquisitor Voss, it was the ultimate weapon of morale, a physical symbol of the Imperium's refusal to break. But to Georgy Zhukov, standing in the subterranean pumping station beneath the altar, it was a tactical suicide note. The smell of raw promethium was overwhelming here, a thick, oily scent that clung to the back of the throat. Zhukov walked along the massive pipes, his gloved hand tracing the vibration of the fuel. These were the primary arteries of the entire planetary defense. If these pumps stopped, every tank would freeze. Every Valkyrie would fall from the sky, and the steel ring would become a graveyard of cold iron. The enemy, led by the distortions of the Numerarch, was moving, with a singular, terrifying focus, toward this very spot. They didn't want the icons, they wanted the fuel. Zhukov returned to the command dais in the heart of the sanctuary. Voss was there, her power armor gleaming under the light of 1,000 votive candles. She was surrounded by colonels who were pledging to die for every inch of this holy ground. The map on the table showed the enemy's advance, a tide of distorted reality that was rapidly encircling the cathedral. "We hold here," Voss declared, her voice ringing with a fanatic certainty. "The soldiers believe this ground is blessed. If we stand, the miracle of the Iron Echo lives. If we fall back, we prove that even our saints can be hunted." Zhukov didn't look at her. He looked at the fuel gauges on the wall. "If we hold here," Zhukov's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, "we turn this cathedral into a cage. The enemy is not attacking the walls. They are cutting the supply lines behind us. In 6 hours the siege will be complete. In 12 hours we will run out of ammunition. In 24 hours the fuel reservoirs beneath our feet will be seized. We will be holding a holy sanctuary while the rest of the planet burns, because they have no promethium to fight with. This is not a defense. It is an ego trip." The room went silent. The officers looked at each other in shock. To suggest a retreat from the sanctuary was bordering on heresy. Zhukov leaned over the table, his eyes hard as flint. "We are leaving. Now, I want the reservoirs primed for demolition, and I want every soldier out of these walls within the hour. We will fall back to the secondary line at the industrial flats. We will trade this holy ground for the survival of the army's mobility. We win by being able to move, not by praying in a basement." Voss stepped forward, her face pale with fury. "You would destroy the heart of their faith. You would tell them that the Iron Echo is a coward. If you give the order to retreat, the myth dies, Zhukov. The soldiers will realize that you are just a man, and they will break. The miracle is the only thing keeping them from the warp's despair. Zhukov looked at her, his expression one of grim, weary pity. Then let them break now so they can learn to stand on their own feet. A faith that can't survive a tactical withdrawal isn't faith, it's a suicide pact. I'm not losing this war for a statue. The retreat was a scene of utter devastation. As the soldiers marched out of the gilded gates, their heads were bowed in a silence more profound than any prayer. They looked back at the sanctuary, waiting for the saint to perform one last miracle. Instead, they saw the demolition charges blow. The spires of the iron echo collapsed into the very fuel pits they were meant to protect, a massive plume of black smoke rising into the bleeding sky like a funeral shroud. Voss sat in the back of a chimera, her head in her hands, her vocal weapons shattered. Zhukov stood on the roof of the vehicle, his gray coat covered in soot, watching the fire. He had saved the fuel, but he had killed the legend. And as the ash began to fall like gray snow, he knew the real war. The war for the soldiers' sanity had only just begun. Thank you for watching this chapter of the Iron Echo's journey. Your support means everything to us as we explore the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40K universe. If you believe Zhukov made the right choice by prioritizing fuel over faith, or if you think he just doomed the planet's morale, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter. See you in the next one.